The
The
singing
Fruit
farm.
Frogs one.
I love the names of the farms.
Oh, I do too. We have one up here called Foggy Hog, and they sell pork and beef. And
Well, I actually have a good friend of mine in the farming industry from Iowa. I spoke at his conference about 3 years ago. His name is Bob Strait. And he has been one of the early farmers speaking up about glyphosate. A lot of farmers just won't admit it's a problem, or they don't want to talk about it, or the ag companies have them snowed over anyway. But Bob has done a lot of education, and his grandson died of cancer, which got him even more focused on the glyphosate, because he was pretty confident that that was a contributing factor to his grandson's cancer. And he now has bile duct cancer.
oh
And
boy,
that was diagnosed last fall, and they only gave him a few weeks. He was doing pretty well a few weeks ago. I talked to him, and he still sounded pretty good, but I got a call this weekend that he went into hospice. And
oh,
that's a very unusual cancer. I've not heard of many people having bile duct cancer, but
yeah.
anyway, he does a lot of education around glyphosate, and I have a lot of his materials and information that he shared with me over the years. And I think one of the main, well, there's so many ways that it acts on the overall ecosystem, but this book. So tonight we're discussing what your food ate. So I don't know if everybody read it. Susan and I were just talking. She's pretty far into it. But the discussion around what's happening to the microbial populations in the soil and in our bodies. I mean, I talk a lot about that in terms of, we build working teams of microbes. Well, the soil is full of huge working teams of microbes that are supporting each other. But if they are, the good members of the team are killed by all these chemicals, and you're left with nothing but the bad guys, it's kind of like going into the worst neighborhood in Chicago. Not a lot of good is going to grow there. And so that, I think, is one of the most devastating things about these herbicides. And it's right. He's right to say in the book that there are a lot of other herbicides and pesticides besides glyphosate, but many of them are in this organophosphate category, many of them. And one of the other things that many of the herbicides do is break photosynthesis. And of course, photosynthesis is how the plant captures light and turns it into sugar. And those sugar molecules, they're double carbon bonds, and they carry light between the bonds. And so then when you break those sugars, you're releasing the light energy. And I've been looking to try to find see if I can find some research on anyone who has looked at the change in those bonds and the sugar molecules in the plants that are exposed to those herbicides. So does anybody want to share their insights on the book? Got a lot of people with their mics muted, and nobody with their face showing. Could be another Martha. Is it going to be another Martha? Susan, why don't you share a little bit more with us?
Well, I've read 2 other books by David Montgomery, and he actually probably lended his name to the female that wrote the book with him, Anne Bickler.
That's his wife.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I know one of the books I read, he said his name was added because he was more well known. So, okay, that explains that.
Yeah, they're
So,
married.
so anyway, and I've read a lot of other books on soil. So, but I kept picking up little bits that reinforced my knowledge. And there were so many interesting parts. I learned that whether crops are genetically engineered or not, relying on chemical fertilizers increases demand for pesticides, while pesticides in return increase demand for fertilizers. And the one thing I really gotten down is that I think within the last 10 years, maybe, is when they've actually realized how all the microbes and the mycorrhizal fungi and the whole process, how everything feeds something else in the soil that helps the plant get its nutrition and just helps the soil so it absorbs water, the worms in the soil. All of that is so interesting. And the problem with conventional farming, industrial farming, using chemicals and fertilizers, is they disrupt that process, and they get higher yields with conventional crops, but they have half or less than half the nutrition. So because they break that cycle, so the nutrition doesn't get to the plant. So they've been just going about it all wrong for decades. And actually, I was so impressed with, there was the part about Lady Balfour in England, who I think it was in the late 1800s, really studied agriculture and had a farm where she learned a lot about what works, the organic materials, or the mulches and composts that are so important, and animal manure that's so important to make this process work. And I'm kind of going off here, but anyway, I just found it all I'm at a part now on page 126 where, I just finished a part about California, Sonoma County, California, and it's just so interesting because it's helping me learn to grow my produce the right way. And there was one other thing that was really interesting, is that one farm actually takes soil out of the forest so that he can, when he's starting new crops, a new area, he can infuse it with the mycorrhizal fungi that are in the wild forest to help give it a boost. And so anyway, those are some of the things I found very interesting.
There's a scientist friend of mine who, he had somebody he was trying to introduce me to. It never worked out where we could meet, but this is a guy who goes into different areas and will collect the soil from the forest floor and basically inoculate a fermentation and grow those organisms, and then apply that in a liquid, on the farm. So like if he came to our farm, he would go out into the woods and collect the soil off the forest floor, and then he would come back and put it in a little mini tank and grow it so that it would concentrate more, and then he would spray it on the soil. So I keep thinking I'm going to try that, and I forgot that last year. So I'm glad that you reminded me of that. One of the things at the beginning of the book that I really liked is it reinforced, if any of you have heard me talk before about my favorite little book, The Life Bridge.
Right.
Which I probably have right here. It's always on my desk.
I have that too.
It reinforces, how the microbes in the soil are doing what I talk about in a fermented food or in your gut is, they're making the rocks, they're making those minerals available to you. And I think that's also back to like growing the food the wrong way and the plants not having enough nutrition in them and what we've done to the soil, we are in large part as a population suffering from high calorie malnutrition, empty calories, no micronutrients. And last week I had somebody mention to me, or they sent me a podcast of a couple people talking about the Minnesota starvation study. And I was like, what's that? So they didn't explain it very well, or, not in the kind of detail I like in the podcast. So I went and did a little research on the Minnesota starvation study. And if you've ever heard of Ansel Keys, he's kind of the bad guy who got everybody not eating fat. And, because of a study he did back in the 1950s or whatever. Well, it turns out the Minnesota starvation study was also run by Ansel Keys.
Oh.
And they took a group of conscientious objectors during World War II. And I don't think they would be allowed to do this ethically now. But back then, they took this group of conscientious objectors and they put them on a low calorie, low micronutrient diet. And they tracked all these different parameters, and including the psychological impact and the some of the long-term implications. It changed their relationship with food and like long-term. And that was 1944 and 45, I think. And, when I looked at that and read about what they did and their understanding from that study about how depriving people of micronutrients, what it did to them. And to me, it sounded like, okay, if you knew that information, and I'm going to set up a conspiracy here for you, but if you knew the information from that study, which was funded by the Department of Defense and some of the government entities, and you knew what a micronutrient starvation would do to a population, and then you approved a chemical like glyphosate that specifically chelates micronutrients and makes them unavailable. It's, to me, an orchestrated, like, you knew this and you set up a food supply that did this, and now you have a population that is just like the people in the Minnesota starvation study, and it basically sets up metabolic disease. So, it's high calorie malnutrition, kind of the modern form of starvation.
Very interesting.
And, I've been having some discussions with people about this glucose 101 protocol from Dr. Stevens. And, if you look back during that same time period, let's say the 1940s, with sugars that people consumed, they were in a complete food package. The sugar had minerals attached to it. And so it was a mechanism for delivering minerals into your cells. And now, of course, we have sugar that's stripped of any nutrients, but has glyphosate residues in it. So I think there's a lot of things about our food supply, even the carbohydrates. So, carbohydrates are what concentrate the sunlight into those sugars. But if glyphosate is breaking the ability of those double bonds to hold light in the photosynthesis process, it's like all the components in the food are disrupted along the way. And that's, that could very likely be a contributor to why people have trouble with carbohydrates now. And today I was looking at an enzyme. I don't want to go too far down the science rabbit hole, but I was looking at an enzyme called glucose oxidase. And that's actually, if you wear a CGM, that's how the CGMs work, those little sensors. And glucose oxidase is used in all these biosensors and stuff in what they call the Internet of Bodies. But glucose oxidase is also used in a lot of food preservatives and different stuff. And that causes the production of hydrogen peroxide. So anyway, I'm a little far afield of our lovely book here, but it sent me down a few rabbit holes. But I think it does get to the micronutrient starvation that we're experiencing is because of the loss of these microbes that do that transformational work in the soil, and the ability to take those rocks, the minerals, and turn them into enzymes and living matter for us to be able to use in the food, and for the food to be nutrient dense for us.
Isn't that the phytochemicals?
That is. And, polyphenols, everybody's talking about polyphenols, and they want to sell you polyphenols that they synthesize synthetic polyphenols, or they, make them in a lab. In a plant, those polyphenols are in that shikimate pathway that I've talked about before that gets broken by glyphosate. So plants cannot make, polyphenol dense plant material when they're exposed to organophosphates.
I thought it was interesting when I read that phytochemicals help prevent a number of chronic diseases. So if they aren't in the plants, you're missing that protection.
Exactly. And I think that's, I've been, I'm an RCPC, which is a root cause protocol. And a lot of times, people can get really sick if they've been a vegetarian for a long time. Yeah. But I wonder too if part of the vegetarian issue these days is because they're missing the polyphenols. All of the minerals are bound up in the plants they're eating, they can't access the minerals that are there. So they're even more mineral starved than the rest of us.
Yeah.
I don't know. I see there's a Julia's an RCPC on here. Maybe you have a comment, Julia. Or maybe, but you're on mute if you do have a comment. Or anyone else. Sometimes I feel like I just do a lot of talking myself. How about Chris? Do you have any comments about it? I see you're in the car. Oh, you're on mute, Chris. You got to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I missed the opening minutes. I'm trying to figure out how to do 2 first Tuesday meetings a month. I've got it. First Tuesday of the month is popular, so I'm trying different ways to work it out. One of them's doing this one in the car. So but just to talk about the opening a little bit, not to leave your idea about the polyphenols and it just makes so much sense, but reminded me that at the very opening, they said people argue endlessly, for example, over whether we should eat less meat, more meat, no meat, or meat that isn't meat. I thought that was pretty cute, but what typically is missing from the framing of dietary choices is how we grow what we eat. And that's a very simple idea, but it is profoundly true. It is so, so true. And so here I am, a nutritionist, and of course I've had an awareness of that. Certainly, if you're thinking about, buying organic and all of that, but it is so much deeper than just organic or not. I so enjoyed. I'm not really a gardener. I said this, I think, last week. I'm not really a gardener, but I do raise butterflies, and so I'm aware of plants that are, I'm out there, but in terms of agriculture and reading about the different farming techniques and how one thing they talked about over tilling and how that is so destructive to the
Yeah.
ecosystem. And it kind of reminded me of the slightly controversial idea about blending microbes in a blender or not. Do you know whether when you're
Right.
making your, yes. And I know one thought on that is that the tilling or the blending cuts the microbes and destroys them, which apparently is, maybe Martha, you would know this for sure. In a lab, if you want to destroy a microbe, that's how you do it. Is that true?
I mean, there's a couple of different ways. You can heat kill them, or you can shear stress them, which is, blending, or I forget what it's an agitator. It's got a different name than an agitator.
Okay.
Sonicator. It's a sonicator. So
Okay.
there's some different ways to do it, but yeah. Well,
Yeah.
so in the how you grow it, or the difference in, let's just talk about meat for a minute. At the conference I attended this weekend, I ran into a farmer that I had met. Actually, I don't know if you were on here, Chris, but when I was talking about my friend Bob at his conference that I went to in Iowa 3 years ago, I met this young man, and he's a farmer in Indiana. His farm is called Ripley Cove Farms, and he has a laboratory that does at Utah State that does nutrient density metabolomics, and comparing his beef to the average grass-fed beef and to the average grain-fed that he's been testing. And just to give you an idea of, okay, so in his beef and the grass-fed beef had, I guess this is I guess it's parts per million, or I don't know what the measurement is, but his was 377. The grass-fed was 335, but the grain-fed potassium was 0. The magnesium, his magnesium was 21.24. The other grass-fed was 20.44, and the grain-fed was 2.
Wow.
And the phosphorus, so the phosphorus in his was 195, the other grass-fed was 177, and the grain-fed was 41. But here's the real, so lead, his was 0, the other grass-fed was 0, and the grain-fed was 169 parts of
Oh
lead.
my God. Wow.
So, there's more to the story than and then he had some reports on, let's see, so his beef is very low in omega-6s. It was like 1.82. The other grass-fed was 2.25, but the grain-fed cows were 8.14 omega-6.
Wow.
So, just very, very different ratios of the quality of what you're, of what you're getting.
Yeah. Every way you look at it, conventional farming, there is nothing good, absolutely nothing, because it disrupts the processes underground. No matter whether it's fertilizer or pesticides, fungicides, tilling, every bit of it disrupts the natural process. And so the plant doesn't get the nutrition, and then it's full of chemicals, and there's just no way there's anything good about it.
Well, I'll say on the tilling front, because I've spent quite a bit of time with Dr. Don Huber, who's a plant pathologist. Tilling has a place if it is used judiciously, because tilling will aerate the microbes and the soil, and that also liberates some of the microbes and some of the it can be a way of dealing with pathogens. And the problem with no-till farming is very glyphosate intense, because they don't till the weeds. They spray them with glyphosate, and they spray them multiple times a year instead of tilling. So they'll spray and, brown the whole field. They'll plant, and then, they'll spray between. Anyway, there's multiple sprayings that go with the no-till farming. So
the regenerative farming, though, does no-till and does cover crops and eliminates the problem of weeds.
Right. But the vast majority of the farmers who are doing no-till are not doing it that way.
They're conventional. Yeah, I'm talking, regenerative is the way to go with cover crops.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. And
what one thing he said in the book was, rather than, you don't have to specifically do your cover crops can just be your plants. And that's what I did last year. First year I've ever done successful gardening of vegetables. I crammed them together. I put a lot in one bed, and I am letting them, some of them die off, and then I'll be planting. I did plant in the fall into some of the areas where some of the previous plants had died or were dying, and I'll continue to do that to put a lot of different things together, and they basically are cutting the cover plants for other plants.
Right. Well, that's how the old in the Indian the Three Sisters, the way they would plant the corn became the tall stalk, and the beans wound up the stalk, and then the squash you planted right around the edge there, and the squash grew out and kept the weeds away.
Right.
I think Julia had something she was trying to say.
I was just going to say that I'm in Canada, and so our growing season is much shorter here. And so that whole usage of glyphosate and all kinds of other sprays to get the crops ripened sooner is way worse. And also, we're huge geographically too. And so that means that most of our farms are enormous. And so these farmers have a very limited amount of time to get their crops off. And so as harvest approaches, well, actually, I'm 57, and when I was a kid, I grew up on a farm, and I live in a farming area right now. But I never ever saw anybody harvest their grain crops until September or October. Now they're doing it in August and September. They're done by the first week of September. And that's just bizarre to me.
It's because they spray them all. And
exactly.
We were working with an ag consultant up there after they brought Dr. Huber in, because some giant farm up there used glyphosate to dry down the lentils. But lentils aren't glyphosate resistant. I mean, they use them to dry it because it kills the plant right away. But that
Mhm.
also leaves a lot of residues. It leaves residues on the plant and in the soil and everything. And then the next year when they came in and they did some measurements and it looked like they needed some phosphate, when they put the phosphate fertilizer down, and I'm not a chemist, so I'm not probably the best explainer of this, but when they put the phosphate down, the phosphate actually binds to the glyphosate, desorbs it out of the soil, and takes it back up into the plant.
Oh, no.
And so they lost a $14 million lentil crop. So, they're trying to figure out what to do about it and all that. But so to me, I'm thinking, ooh, that's a horrible thing for a farmer. And so I'm having this conversation with the guy and he goes, oh no, they have crop insurance. They got the $14 million anyway. So
Yeah.
they don't even care. They don't even care.
No. And I don't know what, if you ever have conversations with farmers about glyphosate, but the pushback I get is that, and I don't know what to say to this, but they come back with, well, within such and such amount of time, and it's very short. I can't remember what it is, but there's very little residue left.
That's not true. And it's particularly not true in Canada because of the clay soils. So it actually binds into the clay and accumulates. And was part of the issue with this lentil farmer. But it's much worse in clays where it gets trapped in the colloidal mass of the clay.
I'm in a sandy area. Would it still have a lingering effect?
Well, it wouldn't be as bad as the clay, but what you're going to have there is it's going to be in your water table.
Yeah.
It does not, it doesn't break down like this, like they said. It just, some portion of it will break down with the microbes that are already in the soil, but not very fast. And the studies that we have done so far is, we've made a cocktail of microbes that actually break it down much faster.
And I've
Yeah.
used your
Sure,
product.
they're fed all kinds of propaganda from the guys selling them the product too, right? So
they are, and it's really, it's sad, but it's also interesting to me in terms of human nature and the lies that people will tell themselves to make themselves feel better, I guess, or to not feel like they're responsible for what's happening to our health and our food supply. But, I'm not a PhD, but like, it didn't take me long to figure out the actual science of how destructive it is to the nutrient density of the food and the microbial populations. Just a few pieces of information and some common sense. So, the real scientists really know what they're doing, and they're telling themselves some kind of, pardon my French, but bullshit story to make themselves feel better, or they're just, dirty, rotten scoundrels.
yeah.
And you can follow the money. It usually has to do with, where the profit is. All those companies that sell the pesticides and herbicides, and the farmers that make the money and have crop insurance so they don't have to worry.
And, that goes back to World War II.
Yep.
And
They have to have a way to sell their chemicals.
Yeah. I have said a few times to my kids, they kind of roll their eyes at me, but I say, World War II really never ended, because all the scientists who did all the work on the biochemicals and biowarfare were brought to the United States, to our universities, and continued to do the work. And I'm like, do you really think they changed their mind after they got here? Probably not.
There's a real good book on the scientists, starting with the tobacco industry. I think it's Merchants of Doubt, which I read years ago, and it talks about how those scientists were paid to basically lie and have their studies, the outcomes of their studies benefit the tobacco industry. And then once that kind of collapsed a bit, they went into the food and drug industries.
And they use the, public relations to disparage the scientists who are trying to tell the truth. There's actually,
Exactly.
I'll see if I can find it. There's a New Yorker magazine article here. I'll see if I can pull it up and share it. Which is an example of how they go about this. But let's see if I can. So this is the story. You can find it if you just type Tyrone Hayes, New Yorker magazine. And this was written, I think, in 2014. So I met him at a conference in 2019, and he's a lovely man, but he's very standoffish. He doesn't talk to people. He doesn't trust anyone. And I can't say that I blame him. And he basically found that he was hired by Syngenta to do some research, and he was an amphibian researcher. And he showed that the agriculture chemical atrazine changed the sex of the frogs. And they wanted him not to publish any more work on it, not to do any more work on it. And he said, I'm not going to do that. And so he kept doing the work. And I'll see if they have any pictures or anything. So here, atrazine is the second most widely used herbicide in the U.S., where sales are estimated at about $300 million a year. Introduced in 1958, it is cheap to produce and controls a broad range of weeds. Glyphosate, which is produced by Monsanto, is the most popular herbicide. A study by the EPA found that without atrazine, the national corn yield would fall by 6%, creating an annual loss of nearly $2 billion. But the herbicide degrades slowly in soil and often washes into streams and lakes where it doesn't readily dissolve. Atrazine is one of the most common contaminants in drinking water. And I had started looking at it because of a young woman who climbed Mount Kilimanjaro with us, who had multiple sclerosis, and she lived in an area in Illinois where the water was concentrating down. And when I looked at her microbiome and started looking at the microbes and what they were capable of degrading, I told her, I said, I think you have atrazine contaminated water. And anyway, so that's how I first learned about Tyrone Hayes. But I think I mentioned on the Sugar Shift Challenge call maybe last time or whatever, there's a woman named Carrie Gilliam. She writes, I think it's called The Lead, LEDE. But it's interesting. I typed her name into Google, and Google doesn't always do this, but when I type things into Google that are about herbicides or pesticides, it always wants my precise location. It's asking me right now, use precise location, and I'm going to say no. But they are looking to identify me, and what she showed a couple of weeks ago out of that USAID stuff is that our tax dollars were paying for a PR company that was building a database. So because I'm looking up her, or I'm looking up Tyrone Hayes and stuff like that, they would be capturing my precise location and including that in the database, and anyone who was considered an activist or doing research or anything on Monsanto or any of these companies is in that database with information about their families and things that these companies can use to attack them, which is, to me, we're living in a crazy time all the way around, I'll just say. But I'm going to show you see if I can find her report. Let's see. But I always find it a little bit creepy when Google asks me that, if I want to use my exact location. Like, why is my exact location relevant to looking for her website? Shouldn't be relevant at all. And she's written a book. I think it's called Whitewashed. That's about glyphosate. But anyway, if you're interested in knowing more about, somebody who writes a lot about herbicides, it's called The New Lead. And she's been doing environmental journalism for probably 20 years. And her life has been threatened and all kinds of crazy stuff. So back to the book. So what can we do about it?
Yeah.
I mean, we do things about it by educating each other, educating other people. And like you were saying, Julia, like the farmers who say it degrades, encourage them to read somebody's book like Stephanie Seneff's Toxic Legacy or something like this, where it's referring to the references. I mean, I don't, people often won't read something that is more than 20 characters, but, just having a conversation with people and starting to educate them about, the quality of their food, and the discussion in here about, the connection to attention deficit disorder and, I think it's also changing the character of the milk in dairy, because most of the dairy cattle are grain fed, or to some extent they're grain fed. So they've got a lot of the herbicides, and that's going to change the profile of the milk and the vitamins that are available in the milk. And, we have this battle about raw milk.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I mean, those are some very important nutrients in raw milk, vitamin A, retinol.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I think we just need to get really diligent about finding our farmers that we do want to work with. So even though I'm in like a big farming belt here, there are some regenerative farmers. And so I've hooked up with a guy that does regenerative farming, and we buy our cattle from him. So we have a quarter section here of land, and we graze cattle for ourselves and our families. And then I own a health food store too. So I talk to people all the time, and they talk to me, and, information gets out. And so one of my customers milks 3 Jersey cows. And so now I'm getting milk from her.
Oh, nice.
On the download. So, yeah. So it takes time though. That's the thing. Person has to be patient and just always have your antennas up and your feelers out till you find these guys.
I bring up the subject of regenerative farming and getting to know your farmer and being able to ask the right questions. So, how, I don't care if they're certified. I want to know what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But you got to know what questions to ask, right? That's the thing.
Exactly. And so I try to educate my community, and I actually have a website to help the local community find farms where they can find safe food. I haven't done a lot with that in the past 6 months, but it's there for people in my area. And yeah, I I just, it's so important, and I'm going to expand my garden. I'm going to be 80 in a little over a year. So, I'm thinking, okay, how many more years can I do this? But I want to know, I want to do it, and I'll do it as long as I can.
Good for you, Susan. That's great.
It is, yeah. Martha, what about the environmental working group? How do you feel about that outfit? Nonprofit, I believe. Yeah.
I don't know them that way. I mean, I have used their water data before, because they did do I'm trying to see. Okay, who are they funded by? Individual donors, foundation grants. I mean, it's like what I have learned over the last decade is you really have to look at who is funding the nonprofit. What was interesting is back in 2012, the Environmental Working Group did a fantastic study in all these major cities of the chemicals in the water.
Yeah.
And not a peep out of them after that. So then I wondered, okay, did somebody come in with some big funding and point them in another direction? Because that's often what will happen with a researcher who finds something important, is somebody miraculously shows up to give them a bunch of money to focus on a completely different area than what they're focusing on, so they won't finish the research.
And is your feeling that is big agriculture doing that, or do you feel that's, or or
Well, so
government, or
it's a lot. It's a large web, I'll say. There's a book that was written, I think might be the 1950s. It was called Their Foundations, Their Power and Influence. And that, I probably read that about a decade ago, and it really opened my eyes up, because I was also looking, I mean, I have a tiny little nonprofit that does microbiome research. And I was looking at, does it make sense to be a nonprofit? What about nonprofits? And I was in a group with some CEOs, and a couple of them were thinking, oh, I think I'm going to start my company as a nonprofit and do, go down the grants path and all that kind of stuff. And of course, I went down a grants path and got an NIH grant, but oh, good Lord, I don't think I would ever do that again. It's like and that's, part of the problem with science is you spend so much time working on grant writing. I mean, these scientists probably spend 50% of their time writing grants, of which maybe less than 5%, probably 2% get funded. So you're spending all this time to get a very limited amount of fund from grants. And then a lot of these nonprofit organizations where these smart scientists are turning their grant applications in, they get turned down, and some scientist who's on the review board steals their idea and goes and does it. I mean, it's just not as high and mighty as, like, I used to think. I mean, I spent 20 years in the commercial real estate industry, and in that industry, I mean, you pretty much know up front, everybody's in it for money and everybody's in it to win. And so it's, it's all out on the table. It's all up front. I mean, that doesn't mean people don't do things behind your back sometimes, but for the most part, it's straight up combat. And so, going into science or, looking at the nonprofit area, I thought, well, I'm going to be going to this much loftier ideal of a world. And it's just not like that. And I think that for all of us is a bit of naivety to think that there's not something behind the veil of these nonprofits. And, I learned that early on with I've mentioned before, the the nonprofit in New Jersey called Manel that does research on scents and flavors. And they probably know more about the receptors in the mouth and the gut and the nose than anybody on this planet. But, you know, and it's a nonprofit that's all employed a bunch of scientists, but all of their money comes from the big food companies. And
Right.
what they're researching is how to trick your senses to make you want more of these products instead of using their brilliance and acumen to figure out how to use this stuff to make you healthier.
Right.
So
that would be, so the source of that kind of pressure is big corporations, but big food. And it, you know, it involves scientists, but it seems like that.
But it's also the government, because the government has become a revolving door. So the corporate people go into the upper level positions in the government, in the agencies, and then they control where the money goes. So then you get this in the grant process, you know, the people who it's the same old people who get funded all the time because it's their buddies running the top of whatever, you know, group of funding that is. So yes, it's corporate, but it's also government. And and I mean, that was what basically Carrie Gilliam showed with that PR agency that was being funded by some of the corporate money, but it was also a lot of it was being funded by U.S. taxpayer dollars from USAID going to the nonprofit. So through grant money.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's
a big, it's a big problem, big complex.
It's
problem.
a rat's nest. It's a rat's nest. I mean, it really is a rat's nest. But it, you know, it has huge implications on the quality of our food, on the quality of our health care, on the quality of our lives, because there's no integrity, there's no ethics, there's no, you know, it's everybody for their last dollar or whatever.
That's right. Yeah.
And not a step back to think, okay, maybe I am this little cog over here, but what I do has implications to the human race.
Right. Absolutely.
You know?
Well, the more people who learn about what conventional farming does and how damaging, and learn about regenerative farming, the more people, I mean, unfortunately it takes a long time, but people will be demanding better. And it takes numbers. So I don't know how long it's going to be, but
it takes numbers. Yeah. And the buying, you know, the consumer, it just hopefully it doesn't take too long for enough consumers to put pressure on for something better for health.
Well,
you know?
So Jeffrey Smith, who started the Institute for Responsible Technology, he was a real driver in educating people on glyphosate. And it took him about 20 years. But the tipping point is when about 3% of the consumers, you know, become aware and start raising issues and changing behaviors. And so the good news is we're beyond that with glyphosate, but I think we're still early on in understanding nutrient density of food,
Right.
and that we are actually starving. So despite the fact that, you know, there's boxes on the shelves in the grocery store, we are victims of the Minnesota starvation study. And I wrote a blog about it. I can't decide whether I should publish it or not. The title of my blog is Starving While Overfed, How Ansel Keys, Glyphosate, and Big Food Engineered a Sick Population.
It sounds good.
That's
then,
really good.
and I go into also, I think it's, you know, we have had this rise in awareness of the problems with the pharmaceutical industry in the last 4 years. And
Right.
this hero worship of, you know, biohackers and the doctors who are giving supplements and, you know, fixing your problem with natural, quote, natural means. But, you know, when I look at the context of what is now being touted, you know, over in this other faction of, you know, quote, alternative health, it's not that different. and it is also a function of building a metabolic disease market to sell people all of these products that they have now come up with for metabolic disease, including alternative sugars like allulose that now have all these famous influencer doctors behind it. Or, you know, I had the book Good Energy. Okay. Good Energy is touting CGM. A CGM has is using glucose oxidase, which raises your insulin, you know, your blood sugar. And it's a Bluetooth device, which also affects your Bluetooth devices will also raise your and mess with your
inflammation
sensitivity. And, you know, so now you have this whole biohacker group that wants to plug you into the Internet of Bodies with these biosensors. And all the biosensors use glucose oxidase.
Did you just say that CGMs have you hooked up to the internet? I had no idea. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a Bluetooth device.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
One of our fellow alumni, she's just north of me in Edmonton. I'll have to tell her that because she's hooked up to one of those. She's just going to lose her mind.
Wow.
I mean, it's, you know, they read it from their phone. It's a Bluetooth device.
Yeah, like a smart watch and all of that,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of that too, isn't there? And that's what I'm just not familiar with CGMs at all, but you'd think she'd put those pieces together. But I know
Well,
her
I mean,
I
stumbled into the glucose oxidase enzyme and how a CGM and a glucometer works because I was trying to answer questions for Chris over our, you know, this crazy counterintuitive glucose 101 protocol that I'm still trying to wrap my head around. But I think that's part of the starvation scenario.
Yeah. There's so many people that are wearing those watches too that are counting their steps and tracking their sleep, and it's just like, wow.
Yeah, if you go out and search, I mean, against always on these book clubs, I always end up far afield, but if you can go out and search the Internet of Bodies, and
Okay.
it's, you know, there are conferences like the human body can actually apparently be tapped into remotely. So I was at a biohacker conference this weekend that I won't go to again. It was a little disturbing because it was all technology. Well, 98% technology. And there was a company there called Everyday Spy. Have you heard of them?
No.
They're ex-CIA agents, and they teach you CIA techniques for manipulating people and stealing their energy.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And then he made the comment, you know, we're unashamed at the CIA that we steal the energy of people from other countries and give it to you. And at the end, I said, well, you're probably not the only people that know how to do that. So I guess the people in the other countries are stealing our energy. and giving it to their people. So we're basically in an energy war of a nature that most people don't even understand. And
Right.
he said,
Wow.
you're right.
Yeah.
Wow, Martha. Yeah.
So anyway, they have these, they have conferences around the, the biosensors and the little nanobots and different stuff, which I've followed the nanotechnology for, probably 8 or 10 years in Science magazine, because they've had a lot about that.
There's just so much research to do and learning. It's just constant. I mean, I enjoy it, but it's like, wow. Martha, I'm still reading Metabolical by Robert Lustig.
Yes.
So I'm like way behind you guys. I haven't read the book that you're talking about today. But every now and then I come in these calls and see what's going on, or I listen to your old recordings, and it's great. Love it.
Well, Metabolical is a great introduction to what the food industry has done to us. And
Right.
there's some great talks with Robert Lustig on the issues in these young kids with metabolic disease that he was dealing with. But okay, there's all this complicated stuff, devices, everything's bothering. But you know what? It really gets down to something pretty simple if you can do it. And that is eat real food.
Right.
It's nutrient dense. Take care of your microbiome. Drink clean water and get sunlight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really,
And-
it's like go back 200 years. That's what
Right.
it comes down to.
Right. Right. And I mean, it's not that complicated from a story. It's just complicated to execute because of our food supply and our lives, on these computers and on these phones and
Right.
with all these devices and things. It's, you don't
But
want to
something else I
go
wanted
be a
to-
troll in the woods. I mean, nobody's going to go do that.
It's such a good way to be able to think about things, though, that the answer is simple. It's not always simple to execute, but there's so much out there that is overwhelming, and yet there is a simple answer, and that kind of sets the course in a personal way for what to do.
Mhm.
I appreciate hearing that after listening and realizing all this that's going on, hearing about that conference that you went to this weekend, so interesting. Yeah.
But I mean, that's why I always just go back to Sally Fallon's
Right.
Nourishing Traditions cookbook and Terry Wall's protocol, which is nutrient dense food. I mean, you got to do a lot of chopping and try to grow a little patch of garden where you know what's in it, or go to the farmer's market and ask the farmer.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a challenge. Maybe you guys have this in your area too, but where I live, with the growing season being so short and our ground being covered in snow and ice for 6 to 8 months, it's like you either got to grow it in your basement or like eat really seasonally, like get into your root vegetables and your squashes and keep those over the winter. But what a lot of people are doing is they're buying vegetables that are grown in hydroponics, and I can't think that those are healthy at all.
They're not, and I actually think it is really important for us to eat seasonally for where we live, because kind of back to the plant and the animal captures the light and the environmental cues of where you're living. And when you eat that food that is local, it is giving you information about the environment that you're in. And so, if you, but I totally get that in Canada, because I lived in Colorado for 27 years. Same thing there. Like, you're not going to be getting a lot of produce well, you can grow produce with a little greenhouse box, or I mean, you can grow some lettuces and stuff over the winter that are cold hardy, but I mean, you're not going to be growing you're certainly not going to be growing tomatoes or anything like that over the winter time. You're going to be eating winter squash and meat and
Root veggies.
root vegetables that store well.
But our potatoes are sprayed with glyphosate too. Can you believe that?
Well, they're sprayed with worse than that. I was talking to somebody else the other day.
Oh no, really?
I can't remember. Actually, it was a Canadian farmer. Or actually not a Canadian farmer, but he had worked for John Deere in Canada, and he did have a background in farming. And he was telling me something they put on the potatoes. I forget what it is. Not good though.
Yeah. So I won't eat any potatoes unless I grow them. I just don't eat them.
Oh, go ahead. One thing I do is freeze as many green vegetables well, I do grow Brussels sprouts, but I don't have a lot of them. So I did freeze not Brussels sprouts, broccoli, broccoli and green beans. And so I freeze a lot of things that don't grow in the winter. And then I ferment a lot of food. So it's another way to get a lot of vegetables.
Right, right. My dad was telling me that they actually had a salt house that they built out of straw bales, and a lot of the meat would be cured with salt, and they didn't have a freezer. So I don't know how they did it, but anyway, I'm sure if a person looks hard enough, you can find out how you survive a winter and stay healthy.
So there's in Kentucky, which is where I am now, and that's where I grew up. We're known for country ham, and I don't know if anybody knows country ham, but country ham is super salty.
Yeah.
I mean, like, whew, you will be drinking water like crazy for a week after you eat Kentucky country ham. But I love Kentucky country ham and biscuits, but I mean, my dad used to get the ham, and I mean, it would be like hanging out in a barn, with the salt cure on the outside of it. But when he would bring it home, I mean, it was covered in mold, and they would scrub the mold off. I mean, it was the craziest thing, but
and nobody died from it.
Well, I mean, some of those molds, if you think about it, like penicillin is a mold. It kills a lot of microbes. So, depending on what was on there. Anyway, but a lot of those skills are lost. So we have Tom and David on here, and Dawn, they're all being quiet. Do you guys want to chime in here? Or are you just quietly listening? I guess they're just quietly listening.
There you go.
There you go. Hi, Tom.
I am listening to everything. I totally agree. I'm scared to death of all the chemicals in our food, and unfortunately, not being a plant expert like yourself, it's almost over my head as far as the all the poisons and all the lack of understanding. And so I'm just listening to people like yourself because I trust you. I'm taking the sugar shift and the microbiome, and I followed Dr. Davis, and I'm taking his microbiome for whatever it does, and
Right.
and I just smile a lot. I'm dreaming better. I don't know that I'm sleeping better. I feel healthier, but I'm still getting older. That's the scary part, So what do you do? So
We're all going to get older.
I give thanks to you. My only looking skeptically, and I'm not a skeptic, but but it's almost trust because you can't really see. Everything's so small, you really don't know. The fact that it's curdling, is it really, really, really a yogurt? I think it is. You know, my hair is still gray, so you know, it's not changing that. And I don't know. And now I'm mixing the sugar shift with his microbiome, and I'm trying to do it in a yogurt, and everything is so, it's like positive, but yet it's not exact. I don't know exactly what it's doing, and I don't know if I have 20 billion or 20 trillion microbes.
Well,
or, you
I
know.
think there's sometimes a little too much focus on, you know, does it have 20 billion or 100 billion or 300 billion? And, you know, you just want a nice colony of those good quality living microbes in your yogurt or in your kraut or, you know, whatever it is that you make. You've made a colony of organisms that are working together. And like, I think people can get too caught up on if it's perfect. You know, it's not. Mine's only perfect about once every, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. So, you know, but it always tastes good, but it's not perfect. Like the one I made last week, one I made 2 weeks ago was perfect. The consistency was perfect. It was great. Then I made another batch and I made it like twice as big. And, you know, I had to strain a lot of whey out of it. I strained almost a quart of whey out of it. So
I read that it's only good. I mean, it's really efficient for like 2 weeks, and then after that, it loses its efficiency. Is that true?
No,
no.
Okay.
it'll keep for over a month actually.
And do
Jen,
you ever use whole cream or only half and half?
I use half and half.
cream. I use cream sometimes. And when I use cream, it's like ice cream.
Oh yeah.
That's what I want. I love ice cream. Okay.
But, you know, I did find when I was making it with cream all the time that I felt like I was gaining weight. That probably wasn't very smart because I loved it so much and I ate it all the time. And so I've cut back to going to half and half again.
Okay. All right. Anyway, but I thank you for all that you give, and believe me, I know I know that there was a dimension between you and your husband, and I know that there's a big dimension in your heart for what you're doing, and I give thanks for that. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you,
All right.
Martha.
Well, thank you. Thank all of you. We're a little bit over our run tonight, but I do think this is a great book, particularly for any of you who are, you know, if you do have an interest in gardening at all. But, you know, just to hear us talk about it, I mean, all you have to do is just talk to the farmer at the farmer's market. I mean, I find that's one of the best things of all. It's just have a conversation with them. Because I talked to one in Colorado that I used to buy from a lot. And, you know, he told me, you know, when certain vegetables are really small, I have to put a little bit of chemical on them. He said, or all the, you know, these certain worms or bugs will eat them all up. And he's like, but I don't put anything on them again after that. And they're harvested, you know, 60 days later. So, I mean, you can ask them questions like that and they'll, you know, they're very honest about it. And they don't really want to eat the chemicals either.
And most
All right.
farmers would love to talk about farming all day long. So if you ask them questions, they'll tell you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Anyway,
All right.
thank you all. I'm going to go.
We'll wrap it up tonight. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you next time. The book is Breath by Nestor.
Oh, I've read that.
And that's a great book with a lot of kind of sad information, but breathing actually feeds the microbes. So we'll have a little bit of discussion around that too. So good night.
Night.
Thanks.
Night.
Thank you.